Hello and welcome to Politics in the Pulpit. This is a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask that provocative question of whether, and if so, how, politics should appear in our preaching this week. My name's Beth Allison-Glenny. I'm a Baptist minister and I'm working as the Baptist Union of Great Britain's Public Issues Enabler and I'm part of the Ecumenical Joint Public Issues team. Each week, I'm joined by a guest from a different place or space on the political or pulpit landscape. And today I'm really pleased to introduce the Reverend Andrew Hammond, who's chaplain at St John's College, Cambridge. Welcome, Andrew.
Hello, good to see you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And politics in the pulpit, I wonder, what does that mean for you and your context and where you're coming from today?
Yeah, so you can imagine working with students. Well, you could imagine that it's a highly politicized context, that students have, a very kind of lively sense of things political, and that's true to an extent. But the way in which I'm serving them doesn't necessarily immediately relate to that aspect of what they do. I mean, you can imagine here, this is one of the colleges that has a very big choral tradition. So we have, a grand chapel with very kind of ornate, dignified, fantastically beautiful and accomplished services from a musical point of view. And then there's the rest of the college where there are about 1,000 students here. That's including postgraduates. Quite a fair few are international, which brings in its own array of issues and ways of understanding the world and engaging with it. And I've been a chaplain in Cambridge for 6 years now. So I was at King's before, which also has a choir, people may have heard of, and now at John's, which of course I think is better. And and I remember, because I was a student here in the 80s, and as a child, obviously, and I remember there was a very considerable engagement by students in politics and certain political issues, which usually had a very strong ethical vibe to them as well. So then it was anti-apartheid, it was CND, it was the miners' strike and Mrs. Thatcher, all that kind of stuff. So big outward focus, very campaigning sort of attitudes. And I expected to encounter just the same thing when I came back to Cambridge. And it hasn't been quite the same. And obviously the issues are different. But I think students are definitely very different from people from how we were students for a whole raft of reasons. And actually, even in that short space of time, that 6 years, the way in which I see students, obviously they're different from each other, but the generality of how students engage with politics has changed. It was, you might say, a little quiet in a sense. I mean, things like identity politics, the culture war about speaking and no platforming, that kind of stuff was building up. But it's certain things have really seemed to galvanize people's interests just in the last 3-4 years. The environment, obviously, in the climate emergency, not so much kind of national politics, but international politics, and then how politics and the way that the world works relates to really important issues like the way in which women are properly treated and respected. And Black Lives Matter obviously was a powerful stimulus to political engagement by people, and other issues of personal identity as well. So I have this interesting, I have this very particular liturgical context, to which some students come, and we do indeed have an early morning service on a Sunday, which is without choir. That's like the sort of parish communion, really, for students, and indeed only for students, not for visitors from outside. And then this kind of general engagement as makes sense and as they're open to, for me, in the students, which is either pastoral, I mean, it's absolutely about welfare, being part of the welfare team, or trying to be helpful and involved in what I would call the liberation issues. So the students' unions have their liberation officers, BME, LGBT, women, and disability, and all the access stuff, all that. So it's quite varied.
I'm right thinking you run another inclusive church space as well. Is that right?
So I began that, and I've left them to it. So it taxed me that in Cambridge, the churches that seemed to be the most energetic in terms of student attendance were types of evangelical. Conservative evangelical, charismatic evangelical, that's in the Church of England. And then, there was Baptist, I think there were 2 Baptist churches in Cambridge and various other independent and smaller churches. But there didn't seem to be any church space, as opposed to a chapel space, where you might say more kind of progressive liberal outlooks on certain issues, and certainly to do with things like sexuality and gender identity, and indeed a proper understanding of what patriarchy actually means, just didn't exist. So, and I've been doing this thing at King's called Critical Mass. It was a sort of late night, very effective, affective, well, it turned out to be effective too, Eucharistic sort of thing. We just sat on the floor and we had loads of smoke and we had soul music and we had projected texts and lots of smoke and so on. And I would, it was a very pared down Eucharist service, but the talk, and I definitely called it a talk rather than a sermon, although it was a sermon, of course, I tried to make us speak as directly as possible into what I understood to be the sort of experience and expectations of students. Unfortunately, students, or at least some students, are fabulously direct in telling me what they think. I just love it. It's not a thing that I've found parishioners, some, some will say something, but not many, where students will just say, you're answering questions nobody's asking. I love it. I mean, fortunately, it doesn't happen too often, but that is so helpful. It's so helpful. So I wanted to see whether that could translate into the town, so for a wider body of students. So we began this thing that we call HeartEase, just as a nice word, but it's it's very much the idea that it's speaking to the heart as well as to the head, really. And we did that at the Second Church of Great St Mary's, which is called Michael House. And I think I was trying to reproduce Critical Mass, and I had one term to do that. And then I was moving from King's to John's when Sunday nights weren't really possible for me anymore. And I'd been billing this as a student-led church. I really wanted it to be, but they'd rather sort of, there were students involved, but I think the power balance wasn't quite right. It was as though I was still a bit dominant. So because I needed to step aside, they were then able to develop it. And that is indeed what they've done along the lines that they preferred, which is great. I mean, that makes sense of it being a student-led service. So not so Eucharistic, for one thing. And also they then aligned it with the SCM, the Student Christian Movement, which is the other Christian union for students, got a long heritage and is considerably less conservative than the Christian Union. It's KICU, it's called here, which has a very definite kind of tenor.
Statement of faith.
yeah, they have their whole, you have to sign the thing, and it's I think it's good to have this much broader ecology of Christian life when you've got 30,000 more, brilliant and varied students in a place. There ought to be choice. Yeah, so that was that. Yeah.
So I always ask if there's an issue or a topic or something that you think, as our preachers are starting to prepare this week, that you kind of want them to know is happening, or just to be listening into, or something that just has been a passion for you in kind of how you approach politics in the pulpit.
Yes. So it's interesting, isn't it? You can imagine people sort of shying at the very title politics in the pulpit because it's so easy just to slot into thinking of party politics or more broadly partisan politics. And I think I do believe quite strongly that party political affiliation declared in a pulpit is quite a risky thing to do. I've certainly not felt able to do that myself, not least because if you are affirming that you belong to a party, the implication of that is that you buy into all the policies of that party. You have to do some quite fancy footwork. I mean, either you just do, which would be very odd, it seems to me, or you sort of pick and choose and have to keep kind of finessing that, which takes quite a lot of time and effort, really. I mean, if you're with a community of people that you're with all the time, then clearly that's going to develop. But having said that, the notion that you can't talk about matters of political importance, matters on which politicians are going to make decisions. And then in the wider sense, as other speakers you've had have been saying, it's, how we lead the good life as a body of people living together in our various sizes of community. I mean, that's absolutely fundamental, seems to me. But at an even more general point, whatever your community, and especially a community like mine, who are kind of fizzing with thinking about everything, and in that very interesting transitional period when they're changing from being children to grown-ups, not to relate anything that you put together to say in the pulpit to the reality of life, and specifically the reality of their lives, it would be bonkers. You know, they spend quite a lot of their time listening to teaching and reading about stuff, which is important for their degrees, which may or may not speak to the life as they live it. And it's not about a kind of slavish desire to be relevant or attract attention. It's just that, you know, what was Jesus about? He wasn't a lecturer. He wasn't writing a book. So, and I, you know, one of the pieces of advice I got quite early on, my incumbent, when I kind of had a long period of what I call devotional doubt in the first half of my adult life, when I was working in the arts and sort of living it up a bit. When I kind of found a church and sort of came back to a more clearly articulable faith, the rector in this church, I was called Mark Oakley, who's now in fact my boss here. So it's a wonderful full circle. But he used to say about, you know, he's one of the greatest preachers there is, and one of his guiding principles is, you know, a sermon is an event. You really have to, when you start to unpick that, it really helps. And part of the event, I think, is understanding how you can relate your understanding of what Jesus meant, and more importantly means, to the life being lived by the people listening to you. So for me, that's going to be much less about kind of finger wagging in normal issues of morality that, you know, certain newspapers and commentators would have us do. Much more about, you know, what if there is an ethics, if there's a way of living life that Jesus is encouraging us to do, what's that going to look like day to day? So I do get very agitated sometimes. I get a bit passionate in sermons. Sometimes if, for example, I mean, in the past, I've preached with vigor and indeed anger about, say, the way in which certain newspapers demonize certain groups of people. For a while, it seemed to be, or maybe it's just I noticed, people in prison. Latterly, of course, it's been refugees and people trying to come and live in this country. Makes me mad. So actually, the readings today are quite handy for that. So you could take that line with the readings.
Well, we're going to come to the readings just a moment, and I always ask JPIT to give us a little roundup of some of the kind of what they're hearing and seeing from the kind of political scene, and just to be what we should be aware of and maybe exercised about. And the police crime sentencing and courts bill is back. So it's passed in the Commons, but not the Lords. So there may still be some influencing opportunities there. The new plan for immigration is now back as a bill. It's called the Nationality and Borders Bill, which contains a lot that we're incredibly concerned about in terms of asylum seekers. And the public issues team have actually put a briefing up about it, if that's helpful for people, especially if you're exercised enough to write to your MP as well, then that's helpful to know what some of our kind of concerns would be from looking at it from our perspective. And then there's a report came out about drug abuse treatment in the UK, which concluded that funding cuts have made the service not fit for purpose, and that leaves a lot of vulnerable people without the support they need when really struggling with addiction. And there's other research out today that shows that the pandemic has widened the wealth gap in the UK, which we knew was going to happen, but it highlights the unequal financial impact of lockdowns and the need for action to address debt and support those on low incomes as we emerge from restrictions. And we've been campaigning quite hard about debt in household debt. It's been one of the issues we've been campaigning about. We're really glad to see that that we managed to get some debate in Parliament about that last week. So just anybody who feels campaigny on this, keep plugging away at that. There's be some movement and some thought about that. That's very UK focused. It's also worth saying, Haiti's president was assassinated last week, which is likely to cause unrest in a country which hasn't really recovered from the 2010 earthquake and has been experiencing a lot of turbulent politics for a while. So there are other things going on in the world, obviously, but there's a lot in UK politics as well this week. So we've Spurgeon always said to have your newspaper open in one hand and your Bible in the other. Well, it's more like kind of the BBC News app, the electionary app. But we will go to the text for Sunday, and our readings this week are 2 Samuel 7. And they're Ephesians 2 and Mark 6, or bits of Mark 6, very confusingly. I wonder, Andrew, if there's a particular text as you've looked at them that you think, yeah, this is the one, or is a theme or an idea. Where would you start?
Yeah, well, the tradition of the church that I'm in, and indeed the liturgical context that I find myself in chapel here, is definitely the 8 to 10 minutes. Try and make at least one point that somebody will remember, not expository preaching. It's not that tradition of 45 minutes of verse by verse. I have done that once or twice, actually, much to people's consternation, but more to kind of annoy the music director than anything else. That's not where I am now. So that's a bit naughty, but so actually, it's quite an interesting. So I just yanked my microphone out. It's quite an interesting thing that the church does to give you all these readings, because you either think, well, how on earth am I going to cover all that, or am I just going to pick one thing and then we just listen to all this stuff and think, why have we just listened to all that? And there's a wonderful discipline about having a lecture, it seems to me. Otherwise, you just pick your favorite bits all the time. And indeed, the choice of verses from Mark, as you say, it's bits of Mark 6, is actually, I think, really quite clever on the part of the election. They're not stupid, these people. So I mean, there are so many places one could go, and especially in terms of the way in which we're thinking about how we might preach from texts. So, for example, although the Samuel reading is very specifically about that David, king of mixed virtue, being told that, although he's had the bright idea of building a temple, and sorry, you're not going to do it. It's going to be your offspring that are going to do it. It's a very interesting. You could do some stuff on patience and humility and all that sort of thing. But actually, when you seeing that reading and then reading the Paul, where he's doing his, one of his routine. Well, if it is Paul, Ephesians, should we say, the writer to Ephesians. Doing his thing, I presume it's a he, on the gospel being for everybody. We're no longer strangers and aliens. It's a fabulous shift actually in the passage from the idea of being strangers to each other as Gentiles and Jews to being strangers to God or citizens of the kingdom. Reminds me that, and this is where you could get into quite interesting and risky territory in terms of preaching, that we cannot preach on an Old Testament text without using the lens of the new, and most specifically Jesus. I mean, I just call it the kind of the Jesus lens. If we're not looking through that all the time, otherwise you end up in all sorts of dodgy territory. And the kind of territory, it seems to me, that sometimes underlies or even is, made very, very clear, certain traditions or types of Christian who take views that I would find distressing, and indeed, could be said to be views which underline some of the stuff that you've just mentioned as being in the news at the moment in terms of political moves. There are types of Christian who like to mine the Old Testament for stuff which helps them talk about military aggression, helps them talk about a kind of justice which is punitive, which I would want to call vengeful, especially the death penalty. Let alone how one views what's happening in Israel-Palestine. I mean, I've never dared preach on that. because it's so sensitive. I'm completely fascinated and distressed, and could go on for a great deal of time. But the risks of preaching on it without just mouthing platitudes, I think, are really, really hard. But that sort of suggested here as well. So there's masses just from those two. But I think, especially given the context that I've got, I would probably go with the gospel. I mean, by default, I'd preach on the gospel first anyway, and then just see where the other readings might be referred to in my 8 to 10 minutes. It's very interesting that you get these two. It's like the lead in and the lead out of two much bigger stories, isn't it? So you've got just before the feeding of the 5,000, you've got that fabulous when you know what's coming, you know what's coming. But he had great compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. But then, of course, we don't hear what actually happened. Feeding of the 5,000, and then it's the calming of the storm, isn't it? After that, and then the bit at the end, and I guess my way into this would be, it's possible that it doesn't speak immediately into certain political issues, but is stuff about how we learn from how Jesus dealt with people and apply that to everything in our life, which is going to include whatever we have to say about the political situation, which is, it's compassion and it's healing and it's contemplation and it's action. So that desperate attempt to withdraw, and these, I mean, it's almost comical, isn't it? You've got these people kind of running around trying to find him, and of course his response to being found is just compassion. Which is not a bad principle in politics. Is, if don't go into politics if you don't want to be hassled. Don't put your head above the parapet if you don't want to be hassled. But actually, as a human being, you do need to put your head above the parapet. Otherwise, you see nothing but we're having fatigue. So, I think there's really interesting stuff to be found. And then one could turn it to any of those things. I mean, very particularly the immigration stuff. I mean, I find the language around immigration and nationality generally, and where we can see all these horrible tastes of xenophobia and all the worst bits of kind of populism, the things that can stimulate an unpleasant kind of populism, and then obviously there's masses that can be said about that. But I often find that it's helpful to try and bring in specific experiences and stories for obvious reasons. It's hardly revelation, but because I've been in different places over the years, and before I came to Cambridge, I was in a parish in northwest London, Willesden, Neasden, one of the most deprived Church of England parishes in the country. And one of the things that I would see there was the experience of people dealing with the Home Office or agencies of the Home Office, particularly when they were trying to establish their right to remain. There was a bit of Windrush stuff going on, which was just unbelievable. And one of the most striking things was simply the quality of communication from the Home Office or their agencies, and indeed the lawyers they hired, who were being paid tums halfpenny as far as I can see. Very unprepared. Even the language in the letters sent to people wasn't even just kind of cold and clear. It kind of dripped with derision and suspicion. Horrible. So I mean, of course, what that did was fire me up to try and be more helpful, really. But people always getting chewed up by this, and and you just they couldn't afford lawyers to help them through this, and the nearest they could get to any kind of legal help was so incredibly well-meaning but incredibly stretched. So drawing on that kind of experience without doing the "let me tell you I used to work with really poor people" routine, which students kind of can roll their eyes, if you pitch it right, they're genuinely interested in hearing what I've learned in other places. I was only there for 3 years, but my goodness me, I did learn such a lot, and which has affected and kind of reignited really my sense of how important it is to have something to say, not just as well as being Christian, but out of being Christian, into all these areas. I mean, the cost of living, by which I mean the cost of living somewhere. How much the cost of renting a place. It's obsession with buying a house that there is. It seemed it was fundamental in so many people's lives in that part of the world. Their whole lives were devoted to being able to afford to live. And at the same time, a lot of people were encountering the kind of, not especially overt, but more than subconscious aggression from all outlets of authority, you could say, really. So that particular one I mentioned of the people dealing with Home Office issues. But even getting on the bus and the bus driver doesn't look at you, there's this big glass screen and they don't know. And you try to get benefits, and the benefits officers appear to have been trained to find ways to say no. You've then got these terrible cycles of aggression that build up, where people actually who are having similar experiences themselves, and they're doing not particularly well paid jobs as, say, receptionists in a GP surgery or secretaries in a school, who encounter frustration in other people, and you build up this cycle that they become aggressive in response. Can be, and you just getting a GP's appointment, for heaven's sake. So it was incredibly revealing, that level of alienation, really. So I remember one old couple who I used to see a lot, because he was bedridden with diabetic complications. And there'd just been an election, and the mama, I used to call them mamas, really, all these Caribbean older generation, just said, well, they voted in the people that don't care about us. And I'd never heard her talk about politics before. It was almost like she tossed off this. Yeah. So yes. So going back to the Mark passage, I could see this message forming in your eyes saying, "Give us
I was going to tell you that.
I was saying, the contemplation, the compassion. So you come out of a contemplative. You have to make time for contemplation. There is this. I like talking about the terrible modern obsession with busyness.
Yeah.
And it relates to a bigger thing, which actually really does matter to students. Well, I think it should matter to students, which is this constant projection onto them of the need to be amazing, compare and despair, and all that sort of thing. Now here I can talk about that. I can talk about busyness and then how that relates. But I mean, I had to catch myself in that parish I was talking about. If you've got a lot of people who are either retired or out of work,
yes,
they don't want to hear some kind of well-meaning middle-class person angsting over them about busyness. They'd love to be busy. So
the dignity of it, actually, there's a dignity in being busy, because it's how we measure social worth at the moment.
Yeah. Absolutely. And the theology of good work is important in itself, isn't it? Yeah, and very real, not just theoretical.
I think it's interesting. I always think that the word compassion, to have your kind of bowels spill open, isn't it? It's like a really gutsy feel about it, and I think it's such an interesting word when the whole thing is about having enough time to eat or not, and then obviously there's a feeding miracle in the middle. And we've got edited out today, but it's this kind of bit about like actually, Jesus has said, I'm going to look after you and make sure you're fed and pay attention to your needs, and these really practical things, which actually then they don't get that food. But what the twist is, and the bit that we have edited out, is that Jesus then says, well, you feed them. And then they have a panic because they don't have any money. How are we going to do this? We can't afford that. And Jesus obviously feeds them.
Yeah,
feeds everybody else at the same time. And I think it's a really interesting kind of thing about that. And I also think the other interesting thing is that they've is this idea about the coming and the going, actually, and the feet. So all these people arrive on foot, and it's just been that they've been told to go on this mission before, where they have to wear a pair of sandals, take only a staff, and they've gone to shake the dust off their feet if they've, so there's something here about kind of what what kind of is going on. It's very ordinary walking. It's trudging. This isn't the wealthy arriving, is it? This is the hungry arriving. And I think there's something to me that's quite encouraging about the fact that they are comprised of it, but also this is the bit that the gospel is about. It's about these parishes that have like angry Home Office letters, and having written quite a lot of angry responses to angry Home Office letters, I know, like, there are just there's absolutely a thing, isn't there? You turn up with somebody to their benefits appointment, they get the benefits. If you don't turn up in a clerical collar to their benefits appointment, they don't get the benefits. It's those sorts of
it's an amazing advantage, this. It really is in that respect. But that the capacity to be part of the extraordinary and the very ordinary, which sounds like a kind of spinny phrase, but it's so much about what we're about, isn't it? Just, a version of that I began to get us into in that parish, and which it interestingly doesn't happen here, maybe because we're a more transient population for obvious reasons, is community organizing. And citizens, London citizens, as part of Citizens UK, I thought were just fabulous, and had found this magic trick, really, of rather than it being like those endless community forums where the same people go and complain about the same things and nobody can do anything about it. What I mean by the magic trick is a bunch of well-motivated, skilled, on the whole rather sort of middle class people can arrange for a proper bottom-up campaign about a specific issue in a community, in a way in which the people there feel not just engaged but actually empowered, because it is about finding where the power is, isn't it? I just thought that was tremendous. I was just looking, I've in a very sort of show-offy way got my Greek New Testament here, because when you were talking, where's the compassion word? Which verse are we in?
He had compassion over 34, verse 34.
34. I was looking at 43. I guess it is that splankno word, isn't it? We weren't taught much about preaching at Westcott House. I think they rather assumed that we'd kind of be able to do it, which was turned out not to be true in many cases, but mine included probably. But I remember somebody saying, if you have to mention a Greek word, you've lost the plot. You're just not. And I think actually no. I think just occasionally, it's not without it becoming a lecture. And I've done this in any context. It seems to me really interesting that the word for compassion is that splankno word. There's even a splanchnic nerve or something inside us, isn't it? It's this visceral sense of how compassion works. It's a bit like that word, when Jesus is very distressed at the raising of Lazarus, where it's the same word that in Greek is for when a horse shakes its head. That thing, when it's just kind of he's shaking his hair, and but then so it's if I was going to do my Greek words thing, there'd be that for the compassion thing. So you really get this sense. Compassion isn't just kind of vaguely feeling sorry for somebody, but then that the word, the very end of the chapter, they were being healed, is the same word as being saved, and that actually there's something very powerful about understanding the relationship between healing and salvation. And it gets us out of our heads. We need to be acute in our analysis of real, and as we were saying, ordinary. We need to understand the particularity of the ordinary. But if we think that Christianity is just about a bunch of ideals and principles and confessional statements, either you just have this kind of weird dichotomy between what we think about some important stuff and then how we're nice to people as we go around, or have some political views. But the fact that these things are so fundamentally tied together by this combination of kind of gut-based compassion and a notion that healing is part of salvation, it's rather nice sort of bookending of what are in fact bookends of two stories, aren't they?
Yeah. I like the phrase that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak, and I just thought it's a reference back, isn't it, to the woman who doesn't have a name, reaching out to have it, you know, for her, salvation and healing are the same thing. She's not allowed to worship with a body that doesn't conform to society's expectations. So she is not allowed salvation effectively without having that hemorrhage desist. And actually, I think at the moment you look, I think it's certainly true. A lot of people talking about trauma at the moment in light of COVID, and I think there is something about how trauma impacts the body that it, you know, people know, but I think we've probably just started to really understand that the kind of level of connection that is. And actually, you know, these things are connected in some quite profound and important way. How we view things maybe in our heads or on our hearts or whatever in ourselves, then actually we kind of, you know, impacts the way we are physically. And I just think, you know, we talk about mental illness quite a lot, and I think my experience, mental health, it almost always is connected to physical health. You know, people talk about anxiety attacks. They don't mean something that they're kind of just thinking in their head. They mean the whole physicality of it. And I think that's true across a lot of different issues as well. And similarly, if you're unhealthy, you know, you're unwell because of some disease, some experience of life, that affects everything. That can affect you mentally so much as well, and spiritually. I think it's so connected.
The body matters. Rowan Williams is talking a lot about this at the moment, isn't he? He thinks it's one of the great horrors of the age, really. That this kind of this forgetting what it means in, you know, in so many ways to be embodied. I mean, I've had periods of depression, one in particular, in the past, and I know how that manifests itself. I didn't have panic attacks, but I did have that terrible lassitude where you just don't feel able to do anything. But even just taking seriously the bodies of others, I mean, our own included, but you know, and so again, you come back to immigration and prison reform and so on. If you don't have that kind of gut-based feel for how important another person's body is, as being fundamental to who they are, it's terrible. So there's the body matters theme is something I come back to a lot, and it's got so many manifestations for people. We know we're not, what phrase I use sometimes, you know, we're not, there isn't just a real me carried about in an accident-prone container, which is my body, you know. It's funny, isn't it, that some sorts of Christian and indeed other thinkers who are the most robust in some of the ethical principles they wish to brandish are the least interested in what it is to be embodied as a person. It's fascinating.
And I think that actually carries over in the styles of preaching sometimes as well. Like, I think if it's an embodied event, to go back to saying preaching as an event, it's an embodied event. You know, you have a body. I know that because my body sometimes allows me to preach, and sometimes it bars me from preaching. And actually, you know, the kind of you might be set in a space and a place in a certain style, and everybody else's bodies. And at the moment, we're doing this sort of virtual hybrid thing, and that's slightly disembodied, and that's its own strange, actually, because there is something about kind of I don't know, like, I think if you can't smell the smelly person in church, there's just something a bit funny about the way we do church. And I'm not critiquing anybody who's managed to hold a church for a pandemic. I think everybody's done it's extraordinary, but I think that's the bit I've discovered I've missed when churches haven't been open. And I think there's just something about that kind of physicality of worship and being together that I think is actually a theme in all of the passages, because there's David, who's a shepherd, and shepherds, you know, usually smell like their sheep, right? Like, so whatever kingliness he's meant to be about, whatever the physicality of the building or not that he wants to create, and God's refusal to be localized in that particular way, you know, there's something there about physicality, isn't there? And there's something about this kind of idea of these you know, the uncircumcision and the circumcision, this physical sign of our bodies and how they divide us or not, which are only male bodies, of course, because that's not. But this idea, you know, kind of actually this flesh, he's made both groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall. This is a very physical bodied conversation going on in Ephesians. And and then it goes into houses, so it kind of connects to 2 Samuel, and you could go in lots of directions, I think, with these texts and talking about bodies and how they create peace or not. And obviously, my politics head on, I want to say something important about the language of citizens. There's something about how we are as citizens that's used as an illustration of what it is to be church.
Yeah, I was quite challenged. I had to preach. So I got tangled up in my cables here. I had to preach. Well, I didn't have to, but I chose to, on Dorothy Day. When I was at King's, we did a sort of occasional sequence of sermons called Women of Spirit. And it was quite deliberately done because it's such a male environment. King's Chaplain is an all-male choir. Both clergy happen to be male. So, and I had this kind of vague notion of what Dorothy Day was about, but I hadn't really kind of investigated. And I did find her fantastically challenging. I mean, not least somebody who, I knew she was this kind of fearless campaigner, a real challenge to people, but that actually she didn't fit a straightforward, shall we say, left-wing model that where there is need, the state should provide. That she had this, it was almost as though she had the notion that the state should make possible for a community to provide for itself. And that was really very, very interesting. And it's quite hard to talk about that without sounding like, for example, you're going down the sort of David Cameron big society sort of route. I've no idea really what he meant, why he said that then. But of course, it didn't help that, almost immediately there was the financial crisis. So it sounded like a very handy way of getting out of, publicly funding things. But actually, what I saw, again, going back to that parish where I was in Willesden, some of the most important work that was making a bit of a difference to people's lives in the community were where groups of people came together to make things happen. Now, quite often they needed some public money to do that, so that was helpful. But quite a lot of it was based on volunteering. And we as a church tried to be involved, so like the citizen stuff, but the food bank. But there was some volunteering little charities that were transforming people's lives. There was Ad Action, all these things. So that kind of big mixed ecology of people looking out for each other seemed to me very important.
And that it somehow works as I was going to call it a leveler, but I think it's almost topsy-turvy thing that happens where the people who maybe hold power and who volunteer sort of then gain something out of it that they perhaps wouldn't have had, a richness to life that they simply wouldn't have had otherwise. It's a gift for them, and then it's also enables and empowers those who perhaps turned up to be, a service user who becomes not a service user anymore. They become people to each other, and I think that's why those. I had a church that had an arts centre in it, and the gift of it was that it was the fullness of people's humanity coming across. That these were lives that you got to share, and that was, and it was about meaning and worth and beauty, and we were talking about buildings, weren't we, just before we started recording, and the importance of these amazing historical, beautiful old buildings and the challenge of keeping them going, but the kind of how important they can be as spaces of grandeur and access points of grandeur to people who perhaps don't have access to any other points of real beautiful architecture and grandeur like that. I mean, somewhere like Cambridge, students get that kind of beautiful wood paneling, and then they go from Cambridge to BMP somewhere where they've got more beautiful wood paneling and there's a natural succession point that actually, if that's if the rest of your world is a grotty Primark shopping centre and a kind of council flat that's a bit dingy and multi-story car parks, then actually those little glimpses of grandeur are transformative.
And they're your bits of grandeur. They're just round the corner from where you live, and they're for you. So, we've got access to the most amazing amount of stuff if we want to see it online or on TV or whatever, of beautiful things. But that's a very different experience from there just being somewhere, a space. It's part of the embodied experience as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think
being
connects to the 2 Samuel, doesn't it? With the kind of, is it a tent? Is it a temple? And you would have only built a palace and you would have only built a temple in a time of deep peace and prosperity, because you wouldn't afford to do it if you were at war. So there's something about the kind of the settled nature of the land, even to be able to build something like that as well, I think, in there, the background. Yeah. I am aware that we're going to have to round up and and go on our ways very soon. Is there anything else that you think particularly want to kind of bring out and or kind of encourage people to think about as they go into this week?
Well, I mean, another political issue is what the government is deciding that we can and can't do, which is mostly can do, in terms of pandemic restrictions or the absence of them, isn't there? And I think, clearly healing is a word that springs to mind and all that. I mean, so much that has happened that we've learned and wanted not to learn in the last 16 months. But I think, it's another bit of how we engage with each other as a community, whatever community we find ourselves, that taking responsibility. I mean, if we're being told we need to take responsibility for how we deal with all this, that's got a whole interesting set of things to be discussed in itself, hasn't it? But I think that's where the this relationship between compassion and healing, contemplation and action, can fire us up to make some altruistic decisions.
And I think for me, I mean, I read it and I just thought, the amount of key workers right now who really need to rest because they have had no leisure even to eat for a year.
Haven't been able to take leave, have they?
Yeah.
A lot of people haven't been able to take holiday.
And I think, I always do a shout out to funeral directors at this point in time, because I think it's we kind of always a bit more understanding perhaps of kind of NHS workers, but I think the unspoken heroes in this to me have been the funeral directors, who I just think every time I talk to them look absolutely exhausted. It's been a really busy year, and there they are handling our bodies for us, with dignity and care, but at their own risk, and in and out of care homes and all of that kind of thing. And I wonder if there's something about, I mean, I guess if you're preaching this, maybe that rhythm of trying to get away, not being able to get away because the needs are still there wherever you go. Even the wilderness, even the deserted place ends up full of need, and just the challenge of living with that kind of constant sense of like giving of yourself, and the idea that the person who is meant to be feeding you has just said, well, you feed everyone else, see what happens. But I think maybe there's something about kind of what Jesus does with that, which is miraculous. I mean, it's interesting that it skips over the miracles, and I kind of like that it does, in that we don't often experience miracles directly like that, do we? We kind of, the bookends of life sort of connote them a little bit more. But I also think it's interesting because they get lost, of course, in the middle. They're meant to be on, they're on this boat. They're not meant to end up in Bethsaida. there they are. Like they're meant to, they are meant to go to Bethsaida, and they end up in I don't know how, is it Gen or Jen?
Gennesaret. I think I grew up saying Gennesaret, but I don't suppose it's anglicised, isn't it? So we can
just with confidence. That's my general view.
I mean, one of the things that came to mind looking at this is I find it very helpful to remember what those places are like, because I did a kind of curate's pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and for me it makes a huge difference seeing. So I did stay by the Sea of Galilee, by Lake Tiberias, and it was absolutely flat calm when we went out on it, and then overnight there was an amazing storm. So I sort of saw both things, which is very helpful in terms of imagination. Maybe I need to see the thing. I'm not very good at imagining. We had the most wonderful guide when you're talking about pronunciation. And we went to Capernaum, which of course he called Capharnaum, which sounded amazing. And I've always wanted to say that when reading it, which of course it would be so distracting for people, they wouldn't hear the rest of the reading. So that was very exciting to hear it properly pronounced. But they are real places. So actually part of any preparation I do for preaching where it seems to make sense, that engaging imaginatively with the actual place seems to me really, really matters. So engaging with, both those traditions, the Ignatian tradition of contemplative immersion in the stories, or the Lectio Divina, the Benedictine thing of just kind of, sitting slowly with the words. Both of those things I find incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
As it happens. And still lead us into things to say about the way things are politically. And just get stuck in sort of the level of nice sentences.
Well, Andrew, it's been an absolute delight to have you. Thank you for
Great.
bringing
It's great to
your
meet you.
thoughts and your wisdom, and I think on behalf of our listeners as well, I'm sure we'll find you really engaging. So we're gonna go out with a blessing. We bless people as they pray for them as they go and prepare. Pray for ourselves as we prepare for our preaching this week. So let's go into both our politics and our pulpits with this blessing. May we be anointed with God's Spirit as we bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Amen.
Amen.